The winter wind over Manchuria carried a silence that felt unnatural. Too heavy, too intentional, as if the land itself knew what was coming. In the early 1930s, while the world was consumed by economic collapse and rising extremism, the Empire of Japan quietly built something unprecedented in the icy plains near Harbin. A complex so secret that even its creators spoke of it in coded whispers. It would become known as Unit 731, though at the time it had no name, only a mission. A mission cloaked in patriotism, ambition, and an obsession with science unbound by ethics. The story did not begin with the facility itself, but with a man, Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, charismatic military physician whose intellect was matched only by his hunger for influence. He believed Japan needed to ascend to the heights of global power, and that biological science was the key. Ishii traveled the world observing disease research, returning convinced that Japan was far behind Western powers. And he knew exactly how to change that trajectory. But Ishii's vision required absolute secrecy, limitless resources, and a location far from the eyes of the world. Manchuria, occupied by Japan since 1931, became the perfect canvas. Its vast, remote landscapes allowed the construction of a research center disguised as a water purification facility. In reality, it would become the centerpiece of a biological weapons program so advanced that even Nazi Germany later expressed astonishment at its sophistication. Yet none of this was revealed publicly. The project operated behind what Japanese officials called the curtain of necessity. And beneath that curtain, a transformation began. First bureaucratic and administrative, then infrastructural, and finally moral. The first stone of Unit 731 was not laid with concrete, but with an idea that national survival justified any action. Ishii presented himself as a visionary defending the empire. He spoke passionately to military leaders, promising breakthroughs that would ensure Japan's dominance for generations. Disease, he argued, could be weaponized, precisely, silently, devastatingly. One official reportedly described Ishii's presentations as a performance, blending scientific brilliance with dramatic zeal. The audience wasn't simply convinced, they were mesmerized. With support secured, Ishii oversaw the construction of a massive complex in Pingfang, south of Harbin. What began as a cluster of buildings expanded into a sprawling fortress of laboratories, barracks, factories, workshops, and underground chambers. High walls, guard towers, and barbed wire encircled the site. Locals whispered about the strange facility with its smoke-filled skyline and constant military patrols, but few dared to question it. Within the compound, hundreds of scientists, many of them young, ambitious graduates from elite universities, arrived with a sense of purpose. They believed they were pioneers in a field that would transform modern warfare. Japan, they were told, needed their brilliance. Sacrifices were necessary. Duty was paramount. The early years were defined by rapid expansion and experimentation. Ishii demanded efficiency. He reorganized units, increased staff, and created specialized divisions focusing on pathogens, transmission, environmental resilience, and weaponization. A factory was built to mass-produce ceramic bomblets designed to disperse biological agents. Another facility perfected the cultivation of bacteria at industrial scale. Everything was calculated, engineered, optimized. Inside the administrative halls, officers often discussed their work with chilling detachment, using technical language that obscured the severity of the outcomes. Reports were typed with precision, diagrams drew the evolution of pathogens, and daily schedules ticked forward like a metronome guiding the rhythm of research. Despite the intense secrecy, the outside world sensed something unusual. Farmers reported restricted zones where they were forbidden to enter. Military trains arrived at odd hours. Local workers who assisted with construction were sometimes reassigned abruptly, and sometimes disappeared altogether. But the empire dismissed concerns, saying the facility was purely for water purification and public health. Ishii, ever charismatic, maintained the illusion. He visited universities, recruiting the brightest students with promises of cutting-edge science. He spoke of national defense, public safety, and the future of Japan. Students described him as inspiring and persuasive. Many accepted his invitations, unaware of the true nature of the research until they were already deep inside the compound. Within Japan's military circles, Ishii's influence grew rapidly. By the late 1930s, he was no longer just a scientist. He was a power broker, shaping policy and directing the empire's biological warfare strategy. He met with top generals, collaborated with intelligence units, and oversaw operations that spanned across East Asia. His voice carried weight. His confidence was unshakable. Meanwhile, tensions in the region escalated. Japan expanded its occupation in China, and hostilities with Western nations grew. The military viewed Ishii's program as a secret weapon, one that could potentially shift the balance of power. And so, Unit 731 grew even larger, absorbing smaller facilities and gaining access to enormous resources. Inside the walls of Pingfang, the environment was paradoxical. Sterile laboratories coexisted with militaristic discipline. Scientists wore white coats but marched with soldiers during morning assemblies. Research meetings were held with the precision of naval briefings. Everything was cataloged. Everything had a hierarchy. Everything had a purpose. The empire's ambitions fueled more construction. Underground tunnels expanded. New laboratories were built. Furnaces, incinerators, and factories operated around the clock. The compound became a self-contained city, with its own rail lines, power grid, farms, and medical units. But something else grew alongside the infrastructure, a culture of normalization. Within the facility, discussions of disease, exposure, and experimentation were framed as scientific necessities, detached from their human consequences. Young researchers were taught that personal feelings had no place in national service. The atmosphere was one of absolute obedience and unwavering focus. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had become one of the most advanced biological research centers in the world. Few outside the Imperial Command even knew it existed. But inside the walls, the staff understood they were part of something historic, dangerous, classified, and irreversible. Rumors circulated among soldiers stationed nearby. Some claimed the facility tested extreme conditions. Others whispered that strange illnesses occasionally leaked into surrounding villages. But no one dared approach the gates. Guards were instructed to shoot intruders on sight. As Japan's war effort intensified, so did the pressure on Ishii's program. Tokyo demanded results, strategic breakthroughs, deployable technologies, decisive advantages. The empire's survival depended on innovation. And Ishii, with his ambition and fearlessness, promised exactly that. However, within the ranks of his growing empire, questions sometimes surfaced, whispered only behind closed doors. A few young researchers, confronted with the moral implications of their work, wondered what path they were truly walking. They had joined for science, yet found themselves entangled in something far darker. Still, the machine pressed forward. On the outside, Pingfang appeared calm. Snow-covered rooftops, silent smokestacks, cold metal fences. But inside, the research accelerated, refined, escalated. The empire demanded answers, and Ishii delivered. Yet every breakthrough brought new ethical fractures. Every discovery carried a cost. Every step forward deepened the shadows. As the war raged across Asia and the Pacific, the true nature of Unit 731 moved from ambition into something else. Something darker, more secretive, and far more consequential. The next chapter would not merely expand the program. It would redefine the limits of wartime science. And in the heart of Manchuria, behind walls no outsider could cross, the shadows began to take shape. By the late 1930s, the rhythms of Unit 731 had stabilized into an unsettling routine, a fusion of scientific rigor and military discipline that shaped the daily lives of everyone inside. The compound functioned as a machine, precise and relentless. Its corridors echoed with the sound of boots, the hum of generators, and the crisp shuffle of paper as researchers documented the results of their work. It was a place where science advanced at a pace few laboratories in the world could match, driven by an environment free of the ethical restrictions that governed research elsewhere. Within the administrative building, senior officers reviewed research proposals in large conference rooms filled with chalkboards, maps, and anatomical diagrams. These meetings, though framed as scientific discussions, carried the tension of military briefings. Ishii often presided over them, wearing his custom-tailored uniform and projecting the authority of a commander rather than a physician. He encouraged competition between divisions, believing it fostered innovation. Scientists presented their findings with meticulous detail, focusing on pathogen behavior, environmental resilience, and methods of transmission. The conversations were clinical, detached, and technical, yet beneath the surface lay an awareness that the work being done could alter the future of warfare. For Ishii, this was precisely the point. He saw Unit 731 as a crucible for discovery, a place unbound by political hesitation or moral caution. His ambition was not simply to match Western powers in biological science, but to surpass them. He moved through the compound with an air of confidence, reinforcing the impression that he was both a visionary and an indispensable asset to the empire. His charisma could be disarming. Younger scientists often described feeling energized after conversations with him. He framed their work as a noble pursuit, an essential sacrifice for the security of Japan. Yet even those who admired him could not ignore the duality of his leadership. Ishii was brilliant but also calculating. He demanded absolute loyalty and secrecy. He cultivated an atmosphere where dissent was quietly discouraged, not through explicit threats but through the unspoken weight of the institution itself. Being part of Unit 731 was a privilege. Questioning its purpose was not. Outside the research halls, the compound operated like a military fortress. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, trained in protocols that emphasized containment and silence. They were told little about the research they guarded. Most believed they were protecting a critical sanitation facility, though some had begun to understand fragments of the truth through observation and rumor. The tension between knowledge and ignorance was intentional. Ishii designed the information flow with precision, dispensing only as much as each rank required. It was a strategy drawn from intelligence doctrine: limit exposure to minimize risk. Meanwhile, the laboratories grew more sophisticated. Microbiology divisions perfected techniques for cultivating bacteria in large quantities. Environmental chambers simulated extreme conditions: heat, cold, humidity, allowing scientists to test pathogen stability across scenarios relevant to warfare. Chemists worked on aerosolization. Engineers refined the design of delivery mechanisms, optimizing the efficiency of ceramic fragmentation bomblets and spray devices. Reports circulated describing the resilience of certain pathogens, how long they could survive in soil, water, or the air, how quickly they replicated, how they responded to temperature fluctuations. These studies were presented not as explorations of nature, but as potential tools. Across Asia, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. The Second Sino-Japanese War intensified, and the Japanese military sought every possible advantage. Commanders viewed biological weapons as a force multiplier, capable, in theory, of crippling enemy populations or sabotaging infrastructure without costly troop deployments. This expectation placed immense pressure on Unit 731. Inside the complex, researchers felt the weight of wartime urgency. Experiments increased in frequency. Deadlines tightened. Reports were demanded faster. Ishii often visited laboratories unannounced, inspecting work with a critical eye, asking pointed questions, and pushing teams to accelerate their timelines. Some scientists thrived under this pressure. They saw themselves as pioneers shaping history. Others felt uneasy but suppressed their discomfort, convinced that their participation was necessary for the empire's survival. A few maintained emotional distance by focusing entirely on data, the numbers, curves, charts, and growth cycles. If they thought only as scientists, they reasoned, perhaps they could avoid confronting the broader implications of their work. But it was impossible to ignore the secrecy that permeated everything. Even routine tasks carried layers of protocol. Protective uniforms were inspected daily. Sterilization procedures followed strict schedules. Records were marked with classification stamps. Meetings ended with reminders about confidentiality. The walls have ears, an officer once warned a group of young researchers. And so does Tokyo. Beyond the laboratories, the infrastructure continued to expand. Workshops built mechanical components for field tests. Farms within the compound raised animals used for biological research. Storage warehouses housed chemicals, fuel, and equipment for deployment trials. Railway lines brought supplies directly into a secure loading area. The scale of the operation astonished even high-ranking Japanese officials who occasionally visited. They spoke in hushed tones afterward, commenting on the efficiency, the discipline, and the sheer magnitude of the facility. But they also understood the risk. If the world discovered the true purpose of Unit 731, the political fallout would be catastrophic. This awareness gave rise to increasingly strict security measures. Guards received expanded training. Surveillance increased. All outgoing correspondence from personnel was screened. Families of researchers knew little about their work. Many believed their relatives were stationed at a simple medical research institute. It was during these years of expansion that Unit 731 began collaborating with other covert divisions in Manchuria, smaller satellite units specializing in specific areas of biological research. Together, they formed a network of facilities under Ishii's command, operating as an integrated system. To coordinate this network, Ishii established a centralized command structure. Officers communicated through encrypted channels. Field tests, conducted in remote parts of Manchuria, were planned with military precision. Soldiers trained in handling contaminated materials. Mobile laboratories accompanied certain operations, allowing researchers to monitor environmental variables in real time. This integration marked a turning point. Unit 731 was no longer an isolated experiment. It had become the nucleus of an empire-wide program. Its influence reached into strategic planning sessions, intelligence agencies, and high command. Ishii himself briefed generals on potential scenarios, discussing biological warfare as calmly as traditional tactics. Yet, the internal culture of the facility was paradoxical. On one hand, it promoted innovation and scientific exploration. On the other, it demanded obedience and conformity. Junior researchers sometimes described feeling like they lived in two different worlds: the modern world of scientific advancement and the authoritarian world of imperial military structure. Meals were eaten in communal halls where conversations were carefully moderated. Recreation areas existed, but the atmosphere was subdued. People knew they were part of something monumental, but also something secretive and potentially dangerous. Friendships formed, but trust had limits. Anything said aloud could be misinterpreted or reported. As Japan's military situation worsened in the early 1940s, pressure intensified even further. The empire demanded results that could shift the direction of the war. Unit 731 responded with increased production, expanded testing schedules, and accelerated research. It was during this period that some scientists began to struggle with the moral implications of their work. They found themselves documenting outcomes with unsettling regularity. They saw patterns emerging, patterns that revealed the consequences of their research. Some tried to detach emotionally, while others compartmentalized their thoughts. A few confided their doubts to close colleagues, though such conversations were rare and always whispered. But questioning the mission was nearly impossible. The institution was too large, too deeply embedded in the war effort, and too ruthless in its insistence on secrecy. Leaving the program was not an option. Compliance was the only path. Outside the compound, the villagers of Pingfong and surrounding areas lived under constant unease. Strange odors occasionally drifted from the facility. Patrols increased. Restricted zones expanded. Rumors circulated in local markets. Whispers of unusual illnesses, sightings of military trucks carrying sealed containers, or the sudden disappearance of workers. But the Japanese administration dismissed these stories, insisting the facility was dedicated to public health and water purification. Few dared to challenge this narrative. Inside the walls, Ishii continued to push forward. He planned new research programs. He requested additional staff and materials. He communicated directly with Tokyo, assuring superiors that his work could provide decisive advantages. Yet even he could sense the shifting tides of war. The empire was being stretched thin. Resources were diminishing, and the world outside Manchuria was growing increasingly hostile to Japan. Still, Unit 731 persisted, driven by momentum, secrecy, and the belief that their work, however controversial, was essential. The machinery of dark science continued to turn. The next stage of its evolution would push the boundaries even further, linking research not just to laboratories and theories, but to field operations across the continent. And as the war escalated, so did the ambitions of the Shadows in Pingfang. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had evolved from a secret laboratory into a fully operational arm of the Japanese war machine. What began as isolated scientific research in Pingfang was now expanding into coordinated field operations that stretched across Manchuria and parts of northern China. These activities were conducted with the same precision and secrecy that defined the compound's internal work. But now the stakes were even higher. The experiments had left the laboratory. They had entered the battlefield. Inside the compound, Ishii briefed his senior officers in a large room dominated by maps and strategic markers. Wooden pins indicated test sites, transportation routes, and villages selected for environmental studies. His tone was calm but authoritative as he outlined objectives: data collection on pathogen spread, environmental resilience, and the logistics of dispersal over large areas. He emphasized efficiency. He emphasized speed. Above all, he emphasized silence. Every operation required secrecy at a level that eclipsed even Japan's intelligence networks. Soldiers were chosen not for their rank, but for their ability to follow orders without question. Mobile units trained specifically for biological operations were deployed, each carrying sealed metal canisters, fumigation devices, and crates of equipment meticulously labeled with coded designations. The soldiers rarely understood the full scope of their missions. They were told only that their orders were critical to Japan's strategic scientific program. Their tasks were described as environmental assessments or sanitation initiatives. The true purpose remained classified. Meanwhile, Ishii's influence continued to grow. His expertise in biological warfare made him an indispensable advisor to military strategists. He met with high-ranking generals, presenting data and projections. He illustrated how pathogens might weaken enemy positions without risking large numbers of Japanese soldiers. His presentations were analytical, filled with statistics, diagrams, and environmental maps. He spoke as though discussing weather systems or agricultural trends. In Tokyo, some officials were captivated by the possibilities. Others were cautious, but Ishii's confidence and the promise of strategic advantage often overshadowed concerns. Back in Pingfang, researchers prepared materials for deployment. Their tasks required intricate coordination. Cultures were grown in controlled conditions, monitored constantly to ensure consistency. Environmental chambers replicated the climates of target regions. Teams inspected equipment, calibrated dispersal devices, and verified sterilization protocols. The logistics were complex. Timing was essential. Transporting biological materials required precise temperature control, shock insulation, and strict handling procedures. Failure at any step could compromise the entire operation. To manage these missions, Ishii established mobile laboratories, trucks outfitted with microscopes, incubators, and basic analytical tools. These mobile units allowed researchers to gather data on-site, monitoring environmental behavior in real time. They represented a new frontier for Unit 731. Science in motion, unbound by the walls of the compound. Field operations were often conducted in remote areas. Teams traveled under cover of night, avoiding population centers to minimize exposure. Soldiers maintained radio silence. Officers carried encryption devices. Each mission ended with thorough decontamination of personnel, equipment, and vehicles. Local civilians near test sites noticed unusual activity. They saw masked soldiers, heard unfamiliar vehicles, and witnessed areas being cordoned off without explanation. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the Japanese were testing new agricultural pesticides. Others believed the Empire was conducting secret industrial surveys. Few imagined the true nature of the work. Within Unit 731, the growing scale of field operations created new divisions of labor. Young scientists were increasingly sent into the field, where they learned to adapt laboratory methods to unpredictable environments. Their training was rigorous. They practiced neutralizing contaminants, operating portable incubators, and recording environmental variables with military precision. These missions were not optional. Each scientist understood that being selected meant they had earned Ishii's trust. It also meant they were bound to secrecy more tightly than ever. The experiences affected them differently. Some saw the field as an exciting extension of their research. Others found the quiet rural landscapes disquieting, aware that their presence could alter lives far beyond their control. Few spoke of these feelings openly. At the same time, Unit 731's satellite units expanded their roles. Facilities such as Unit 1644 in Nanjing and Unit 100 near Changchun became integral to the program. Each specialized in different areas: epidemiology, crop contamination, large-scale production of biological materials. These units operated with similar secrecy and discipline, forming a network of scientific military sites across occupied territories. Coordination between facilities required constant communication. Ishii implemented a hierarchical reporting structure. Each unit's commanding officer submitted classified reports to Pingfang detailing progress, outcomes, and logistical needs. These reports were reviewed by Ishii and his chief scientists, who evaluated them with cold efficiency. Despite the complexity of the network, Ishii maintained tight control. His authority extended across all divisions. His decisions shaped both the scientific direction and the operational strategies. His insistence on innovation pushed researchers to explore new methodologies. His demands for efficiency accelerated timelines. Yet the growing scope of the program also created internal tensions. Resources were finite, and competition between units intensified. Some divisions received priority funding and equipment. Others faced shortages. The pressure to produce results caused friction among scientists, who found themselves working long hours under increasing scrutiny. Senior officers monitored performance closely. Promotions and assignments often depended on meeting deadlines or achieving specific objectives. This competitive environment fostered a sense of urgency but also quiet resentment. Some scientists felt their work was undervalued. Others feared mistakes could jeopardize their careers. Still, the program pushed forward. Ishii believed that wartime demands justified relentless progress. His calculations always pointed toward the same conclusion: biological warfare could reshape the conflict. In the field, operations continued to increase in frequency. Mobile laboratories moved deeper into occupied territories. Teams collected environmental samples, studied water systems, and monitored climate variations. Engineers modified delivery devices to increase range or improve efficiency. Officers mapped outcomes with military precision. Each mission reinforced the sense that Unit 731's work was expanding beyond even Ishii's original vision. The program was evolving into a cornerstone of Japan's war strategy, an asset shrouded in layers of secrecy, driven by scientific ambition and guided by military necessity. But as the war escalated across the Pacific, new pressures emerged. Japan faced increasing resistance from Allied forces. Supply chains weakened. Resource shortages grew severe. This placed additional strain on Unit 731, which relied on specialized materials and controlled laboratory conditions. Ishii responded by consolidating operations, prioritizing critical research and delaying secondary projects. He issued new protocols to conserve resources and streamline procedures. He pushed scientists to innovate with fewer supplies, urging them to adapt existing methods creatively. Some researchers rose to the challenge. Others felt the strain of long hours, rising expectations, and ethical shadows. The atmosphere within the compound grew tense. Conversations became shorter. Breaks between shifts became rare. The sense of normalcy that once existed, however faintly, began to erode. Soldiers stationed at the facility noticed changes as well. Patrol intensity increased. Security checks became longer. New orders demanded stricter control of movement within the compound. Even longtime staff members found themselves subject to additional scrutiny. Outside, local resistance groups began to take greater interest in the facility. Chinese intelligence operatives gathered information, interviewing villagers, tracking Japanese activity. and trying to piece together the purpose of the mysterious site near Pingfang. Their reports were incomplete, fragmented by secrecy, but they recognized that the complex was far from ordinary. Inside, Ishii monitored these developments closely. He reinforced security measures and increased counterintelligence operations. He understood that any leak, even a small one, could threaten the entire program. At the same time, the Japanese military began considering how Unit 731's research might be applied on a larger scale. Discussions circulated within high command about integrating biological strategies into broader operational planning. Though these proposals remained hypothetical, they reflected the growing importance of Ishii's work. As these plans developed, Unit 731 prepared for what Ishii called the next phase. He spoke of it during internal meetings, describing it as a turning point. He emphasized that their research had reached a level of sophistication unmatched anywhere in the world. He insisted they must now translate theory into strategic capability. His officers listened intently. His scientists took notes. The implication was clear. The boundaries between research and warfare were disappearing. By mid-war, the machinery Ishii had built, sprawling, secretive, and scientifically advanced, was operating at full capacity. Field operations were more frequent. Research was more ambitious. The network of satellite units tighter than ever. And yet, beneath the controlled precision, a quiet undercurrent of anxiety ran through the compound. The war outside was shifting. Resources were thinning. Allied pressure was increasing. Unit 731 stood at a crossroads. Its scientific ambitions had never been higher, but its future had never been more uncertain. The next stage would determine whether Ishii's vision would materialize or collapse under the weight of the Empire's crumbling fortunes. The truth about Unit 731 was not only hidden behind walls of concrete and cold Manchurian wind, it was buried beneath something far more effective: silence. A silence constructed with purpose. A silence weaponized. A silence enforced by an empire that understood the power of erasing what should never have existed. The deeper our investigation goes, the clearer it becomes. The darkest chapter in this story is not what happened inside those rooms, but what happened after. Because if you imagine the tale ends with the collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945, you are wrong. The real story, the one no one wants to talk about, begins after the surrender. When the doors of Unit 731 were finally opened, there were no files neatly stored, no evidence carefully cataloged. Instead, the facility looked abandoned in a way that was almost theatrical. Rooms stripped to their bones, cabinets empty, floors scorched as if someone had tried to burn the past itself. A world of ghosts, erased by design. But absence can be its own evidence. And every missing document told a truth louder than the ones that remained. The Imperial Army's philosophy was simple. If something is too dark to ever face, destroy it. And that's exactly what they did. As the Soviets advanced toward Harbin, Ishii Shiro, the architect of Unit 731, initiated a massive cleanup operation. Records were burned in industrial volumes. Buildings were demolished or rigged with explosives. Anything that could reveal the full scope of the program was systematically wiped away. But even this was not enough. Witnesses had to be silenced. Former workers were instructed to disappear. Others were ordered to take their secrets to the grave. Many did. Some had no choice. For decades, historians believed that Unit 731 vanished in the smoke of its own destruction. But then, something unexpected surfaced. Fragments, testimonies, shadows of truth carried by people who survived the war, people who finally dared to speak when the empire that had controlled them no longer existed. And from these fragments, one revelation stood out. A revelation that reshaped everything. Unit 731 did not end in 1945. The science did not vanish. Its knowledge did not perish in those fires, because someone else wanted it, and they were willing to pay for it. This is the moment when our investigation shifts from a story of wartime secrecy to something far more unsettling. A geopolitical transaction carried out far from the battlefield, in a world already preparing for a new conflict, the Cold War. When American intelligence entered Manchuria, they quickly realized what they had found. They weren't just looking at a demolished laboratory. They were staring at decades of research on disease, epidemiology, and biological weaponization. Knowledge that could not be ignored. Knowledge that could not be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. What happened next would remain classified for nearly half a century. The United States struck a deal that historians once considered unthinkable. A deal that rewrote the moral boundaries of science and war. A deal that ensured the truth would remain buried. In exchange for exclusive access to Unit 731's research, its methodologies, its results, its experimental protocols, the U.S. offered something unspoken but unmistakable: immunity. Ishii and his team were never charged. They never stood trial. They never faced justice. Instead, they walked away, quietly, invisibly, protected. The reasoning, according to declassified files, was strategic. The data was valuable. The results were unique. The experiments were irreproducible. And that final word says everything. Reproducible science can be repeated ethically. Irreproducible science cannot. Irreproducible science is the red line, the one humanity crossed once and swore never to cross again. But the Cold War had no patience for ethics, only advantage. And so, the information collected in Manchuria, information built on a foundation of suffering, was quietly transported across the Pacific, filed into clandestine archives, and used to inform early U.S. biological warfare programs. In other words, the truth didn't disappear. It simply changed hands. And while the superpowers of the world built their arsenals of deterrence, the victims of Unit 731 faded into the margins of history. Their stories became whispers, their names erased, their past sealed not by their own nation, but by the nations that defeated it. This is the shadow world where truth becomes currency and morality becomes negotiable. But even in darkness, something unexpected happened. Survivors began to speak. In the 1980s and 1990s, the silence cracked. People from the villages surrounding Pingfong came forward, describing events they had been too afraid to mention for decades. Former workers, now elderly, spoke about orders they were forced to follow, things they had seen but never understood. One doctor recalled seeing Ishii personally oversee experiments. Another remembered the rhythmic sound of machinery in underground halls. A nurse described the way the compound would go into lockdown whenever a new protocol series was underway. Each testimony was a puzzle piece. Each puzzle piece fit perfectly into the gaps left by the destroyed documents. And slowly, the mosaic emerged. Unit 731 wasn't just a facility. It was an ideology. An ideology built on the belief that progress justified anything, that scientific breakthrough was worth any cost, that the ends always justified the means. A belief shared not just by one nation, but by many nations in many different eras. This is why the story of Unit 731 remains relevant, because it forces us to confront a disturbing possibility. Progress without ethics is not progress. It is regression disguised as innovation. And the question that echoes beneath every testimony we've uncovered is simple and terrifying. If the world was willing to forgive Unit 731 in exchange for knowledge, what else has been forgiven? What else has been buried? What else lies hidden in classified archives, waiting for the right political climate to resurface? Because history is full of chapters that were only revealed decades after they happened. And for every chapter exposed, another remains sealed. Unit 731 is not an isolated horror. It is a mirror, a reminder, a warning. As we close this block, the narrative reaches its most unsettling tension. The truth didn't die in that facility. The truth survived. The truth was protected. The truth was used. And what the world did with that truth is the part few dare to confront. In the final block, we face the last unanswered question. What happens when a crime is so vast, so morally catastrophic, that justice becomes impossible? And what does humanity owe to the past when the past still shapes the world we live in today?